you can see within 24 hours of making dietary changes happening within your gut microbiome. So these aren't like, oh, I'm going to make a dietary shift and then like someday 10 years from now I'm going to start to see potential benefit from it. Like, no, you can actually see a shift within hours or days of very simple dietary changes. And so, yeah, it's so happens that a lot of these processed foods have colors added to them, dyes, additives, preservatives, all of these things that allow us to have these very long shelf lives on products, but are actually damaging to the gut microbiome.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next episode. And today we're gonna break down what are you doing that's kind of destroying your gut. We want to cover what are the things that are happening in your day-to-day life or things that you're encountering that are negatively impacting your gut microbiome and could be leading down the path to some pretty intense issues or chronic diseases. Because as we know, the gut microbiome plays a huge role in pretty much everything. And if you don't believe us, just go back through any of the other episodes. We cover it pretty extensively. And I want you to stick around because we're going to go through some of the things that are destroying your gut that you may not even think about. So, Jason, I guess when I think about destroying your gut microbiome, I guess the first question is, why is the gut microbiome so important and why don't we want to destroy it?
Oh, yeah. If we haven't made the importance of the gut microbiome evidently clear in all of our other videos, then we definitely are missing the boat. But not everybody's watched every video. So we got to keep that part in mind. So thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, the microbiome is this living, always ever-changing community that consists of trillions of different microbes. That would include bacteria, which is what most people are aware of course, fungi, viruses, parasites. And although many of them are beneficial to us, there can be cases where there are, for example, in the case of like bacteria, that can become pathogenic and problematic and create like overt disease. Using C. diff, Clostridium difficile, as an example, where that can be very problematic and even result in death in someone who's unable to treat it effectively. And voila, FMT happens to work very well there. But there's a lot of other reasons why this microbiome is so important. And a quick fun fact is that we actually have more bacteria in and on our bodies than we do human cells. And I always sort of make the joke, like, who are we? Like, what's really controlling us? Is it these human sort of cells and the brain and all of that we think about? Or is it really, are we being driven by the microbes that live in and on us and all around us, right? We're always interacting with them. And that's a part of what we're going to discuss today is like our interaction with the world and how that can be beneficial or potentially harmful, depending on how you're living your life. But there's a lot of, benefits and interplay between the microbiome and all organ systems, your immune system, all of the, your brain, your heart, your kidneys. Like there's this huge interplay and crosstalk that's happening. We're not totally clear on how or why, but it's definitely happening. And then it's actually helping us to produce certain things like neurotransmitters that are important for mood and overall health, as well as the building blocks, including vitamins and things that are necessary for all sorts of chemical reactions within the body. So there's just tons of ways in which the microbiome is really, really, really critical. And if there's an improper balance of the microbes within your gut or in any of the other areas that microbes exist, then you can start to, like you said, develop what can be chronic diseases, like even just thinking of diabetes or neurological diseases or cancers. There's an underpinning typically of some GI disturbance, some microbiome imbalance. And it's hard to know, right, what's causing what came first. But more and more, we're starting to realize and appreciate that actually these changes in the gut microbiome preceded the development of these diseases. And when looking at other communities that don't have all of the negative impacts on the gut microbiome, they're not seeing these diseases at the same rates as we are in more Western developed countries. So I think we need to take that much more seriously. And I hope today will enlighten some people on the things that they have control and power over and can make changes on today, and some that you can't change the past. And so it's about taking the next best step forward.
And I think if you're hearing this and going, there's no way that like I'm going to end up with a chronic disease, or there's no way. I think if you can think about being super fatigued or brain fog or bloating or just having like an upset stomach or feeling like, I feel like I'm eating all the right things, but, it makes me feel terrible. Or after I eat, I always feel bad. That's because there's something going on with your gut. And I think we're understanding more and more that there's a middle ground between having your great gut, your gut starting to show, those early signs of dysbiosis, and then we're seeing some of these early signs like brain fog or leaky gut-like symptoms. But that goes on for a period of time. And that's the process from fixable, easy fix, we can make lifestyle changes, to getting into a space where fixing it becomes much more complicated because now we're in the more chronic state. And that's where a lot of the research focus is. But we are seeing more too, understanding what's that in between. And it's very chicken of the egg. Like, is it the gut that does it, or is the gut a reflection of those issues? That we don't know yet, but we know they're tied there. So if you're going to learn something about what you could do to make things a little bit better or protect yourself better, understanding what the hidden kind of things that are destroying the gut is I think the best step you can kind of understand to educating yourself. And so I think I would let's start with food. Mostly because I think when most people think of the gut, they think of digesting food. And it is a really important thing. It does it very well when it does it right. And that's the building blocks to all the stuff that, Jason was talking about in terms of these, vitamins, the right types of nutrition, making neurotransmitters. All of that is because you are eating the right food to build, the things we need. And on the other side is these ultra processed foods, like refined sugars, additives, preservatives, as well as, high fat, low fiber. So these are not the foods we want to be eating, but they are the foods that are all around us.
And they happen to be addictive, right?
Yeah, they happen to be delicious, but
yeah. It's like the combination of the carbohydrate with the sugar and the salt. It's just like incredibly addictive. And as you pointed out, like they're everywhere. Like it's hard to, even go to grocery stores, and the biggest section's not the produce section. It's all of the shelves in between that are all these processed foods. And it, what we're talking about is striking a balance in your life, right? It's like you don't need to make a dramatic shift instantly. But if you can start to make small changes in the choices of the foods that you're eating, and you start to see benefit and improvements, like, you've mentioned this previously, but you can see within 24 hours of making dietary changes happening within your gut microbiome. So these aren't like, oh, I'm going to make a dietary shift, and then like someday, 10 years from now, I'm going to start to see potential benefit from it. Like, no, you can actually see a shift within hours or days of very simple dietary changes. And so, yeah, it's so happens that a lot of these processed foods have colors added to them, dyes, additives, preservatives, all of these things that allow us to have these very long shelf lives on products, but are actually damaging to the gut microbiome. They're not something that's naturally in a food. And so as they, come into your digestive system, like you're potentially able to digest them fine, but the consequences to your gut microbiome can actually be fairly significant.
And I think we can think about too, so we talk about like these foods being addictive. One of the things humans do really well is make addictive things. It's one of our, one of the things we've become good at as a species. But when we think about foods, there's some underlying, we want to eat high fat foods because we think about story, and that doesn't meet our current lifestyle. But there is some underlying, evolution takes a long time in terms of actually changing. But also, what we eat creates or feeds the bacteria, which leads to cravings. So if you eat a lot of high processed, high sugary, high fat foods, you're feeding the bacteria that is then going to ask you to eat more of it to continue to feed it. Because we understand that food cravings actually, we think big part of that is actually driven by the bacteria in the gut basically asking for food. And so they're sending out signals that say, hey, eat more of that because I want more of me. And so as you feed them, that population grows, and then the other populations dwindle. And so that causes a balance of then you want that more because there are more of them asking to be fed. And so we talk about, like, when we look at how we change behaviors and things, it takes 3 weeks to really be able to kind of get past that point of kind of constantly thinking about it, because we have to change not only our behaviors, but also change the populations that are there. We need to feed the other ones so that they can build up and that they get a little bit louder. So then we're not always thinking about, donuts, and we're thinking maybe about like apples or, different types of fruits or vegetables and things, because you will crave those other things as well if that's what your body is asking for. And so there's part of it too, is you have to get past the really loud guy asking for pizza and donuts in your gut and asking, the guy who likes broccoli to get a little bit louder.
And I think
this in my head.
That's the addictions part here as well, right? Like, it's not just a lack of your independent willpower. It's about, there's this drive from these microbes that are inside of you saying, hey, we need feeding. Because again, different microbes require different sources. And so, for example, the fungus that are existing in your body and are natural and normal, and we want them there. If they become too elevated and overgrown, it can lead to like fungal overgrowth. Like, people see like fungal overgrowth on their tongue, or there's lots of, toe fungus, and there's lots of things that can happen. Well, that can happen within your gut as well. And if it's happening on other areas of your body, you can bet it's also happening in your gut. And so it's those fungus need the high sugar, right? So the carbohydrates, all these processed foods that are very high in sugars, they need those to grow and thrive. And so the more you eat of them, the more the fungus grows, and the more it pushes down the other populations that would otherwise like to be fed other foods. But you can, by restricting your diet from these high sugars and processed foods, you can then lower and reduce those populations and allow other species of bacteria and fungus and whatnot, allow that more balanced, play. And the other part of all of these foods that we didn't mention is the impact they have on the gut and creating a permeable gut, or what a lot of times is referred to as like leaky gut or gut permeability, or breakdown ultimately of the barrier. So they're damaging. They create inflammation in the gut, and that inflammation creates a breakdown of the gut barrier. And when you have that, you start to get these inflammatory markers and things that are leaking out into the body and creating global issues that are outside of the gut. So I think, it's fairly safe to say that leaky gut is in large part worsening or leading to the development of some of these chronic diseases because of this gut barrier. And so the way to protect the gut barrier is avoiding some of these foods that we know are damaging and some of the other things we're going to talk about today, but also supporting these different microbes that help to rebuild the gut barrier themselves. Like, that's a part of the microbiome, is it's helped these bugs help to produce, for example, short chain fatty acids that then feed these cells that line the digestive tract. So everything is working together, and again, making a subtle shift to a diet that moves away from these high fructose, high sugar, high carb additives, dyes, preservatives that are damaging, making a shift in the diet to include more diversity, more fibrous foods, and more of the stuff that is easily bought in the outside sections of the grocery stores versus all the aisles that stack up in between, can make a very significant shift if you stick with it over a longer period of time.
And then I think the next big one after diet that we're seeing, I think, a growth things. We are seeing a bigger shift, and we're seeing the westernized diet spread outward. And so we're seeing some of these diet-related issues and gut dysbiosis related to that growing. But the next kind of really big one is the overuse of antibiotics. And antibiotics are really good. They do a very good job of what they're supposed to do. The downside is they're not overly selective. And so they kill good guys and bad guys. And so the problem in the gut is that it just wipes out the population living in the gut. And with that, sometimes pathogenic bacteria go, well, this is a great place to live. There's nothing else going on. There's no competition. I'm not fighting for space. And we see that this can lead to some, a dysbiotic gut, but as well is the overuse or the large scale use of antibiotics that has we're seeing a shift in this now. I think people are more aware. The large scale use of antibiotics and the multiple uses of antibiotics is where some of the big dangers are, because your body can recover from antibiotics. We are very good at bouncing back from things. Unfortunately, how many times can you bounce back before the bounce is less of a bounce and more of a roll? And so that's, we kind of see that becoming an issue.
Yeah, and so you're really right there. And it's the repeated use that definitely becomes a problem. And then it's also the early use. So my background's as a naturopathic doctor. I spent many years treating GI issues, and actually for several years worked with hundreds of families with autistic children. And a lot of these cases, and I tell this stat not because it's a published number, but because it's so common. In the years of speaking with thousands of different families, I can literally list on one hand the families that didn't have early use of antibiotics. And this is not to say, antibiotics cause, autism or anything of that nature. It's just that this population of kids is dealing with significantly more GI issues than their neurotypical peers, and they have more symptoms of GI issues than neurotypical peers. Their microbiome is imbalanced again compared to neurotypical peers. And so something's going on here. And so early use of antibiotics, and I'm sure this is not just the case of that I observed in autism, because that was just a lot of what we treated. I'm sure this is, if you're looking at large data sets and you could understand how early the antibiotics were used, and the likelihood of developing some later autoimmune or other issue is going to be much higher. I mean, these stats, for example, exist for C-section delivered babies and the increased risk of diabetes and other diseases that we know could come later in life when the microbiome is impacted in that way. And so I think the key is what, like, as you pointed out, is not the occasional use is something the average human is going to be able to tolerate with, it's going to still have a consequence, but it's the repeated use of these broad spectrum antibiotics. And then as well, the early use when the microbiome is still really developing and it's not sort of maintained a foothold of something that is balanced and that's working for you. And so I think those are two real big caveats. And the challenge is a public health one, in the sense of like helping to educate both the patient and the doctor who's the ones prescribing. And the incentives, unfortunately, are really pushing doctors to be very much risk avoidant, in the sense of like it covers them if they just prescribe an antibiotic. Because if you have a patient that comes to you and they have something that could be an infection, and you say, hey, go home, let's watch this, let's keep checking your temperature, hydrate, ideally you're telling them to do some things that could support their immune system. But ultimately, if the patient were to, their disease was to worsen and they were to get really ill and need to be hospitalized and potentially die, the doctor could be at risk of, hey, I didn't prescribe what should have been an antibiotic in this case. And so many cases, doctors are just saying, hey, I'm not taking that risk. I'm just going to prescribe an antibiotic just because. And then a lot of patients are going to doctors saying, hey, give me an antibiotic, I'm sick, not realizing that most colds and flus and things are actually viral. They're not bacterial, and an antibiotic will do nothing against a viral disease. And so it's a bit of a catch-22. It's a challenging situation for the doctors as well as the patients, but I think there's a huge opportunity still. And whether you're a doctor listening to this or you're a patient, the goal should really be to minimize as much as possible the use of antibiotics, and instead support the patient with more like outpatient options to help them get through what the average human can get through with maybe a little suffering, but at least avoiding the antibiotic.
Yeah, and I think understanding that if the antibiotic is going to negatively impact your gut microbiome and other systems, how do you build that back up? So while you're taking it and after you take antibiotics, what are things you can do to actively help restore that? And again, we're going to come back to diet, and being aware of the types of food you're eating and trying to eat to help support the good bacteria to come back. So I think that's, an important thing. And you made a good point in terms of, early antibiotic use. We have to remember that, like every system in the body, you are in the early phases creating that system, creating all the signals, creating the groundwork for what your adult-like system will be. And interestingly, the gut is very tied into the brain and its development. They have a lot of crosstalk. There's a lot of in utero connection between those cell types. But as well, when you're out in the world and growing up in your early years, the gut develops and that sends signals to other systems to do the next step in development. And by setting that gut back or altering it, could it cause it to become less developed or develop incorrectly, which then sends signals to many other systems in the body to maybe do it differently than it normally would, or maybe not send the right signals. And so we have to remember early on, impacts can be much more large scale because these are the building blocks, the blueprints for everything else. And so I think it's important to understand that, all of this is so interconnected, but on top of that, it's everything is talking, every system is talking to each other, and so they can have larger impacts. And we talk about antibiotics, but there are other medications, especially long-term use of other medications, we know negatively impact the gut microbiome and can have consequences. So, things like proton pump inhibitors, SSRIs, even some types of pain medication, as well as laxatives. All of these things, long-term use, multiple uses, can have negative impacts on the gut microbiome as well.
And most of those are being prescribed long-term, right? It's not typical that you're going to be on an SSRI for like a couple weeks. Proton pump inhibitors are only designed to be used short-term. Like that's the indication for them. But I've seen patients that have been on them for 30 years, right? Like, so there's definitely, their antibiotics are the big, number one item from a prescription standpoint. But there's definitely others, as you pointed out.
Yeah. And I think the whole goal is like, let's get an understanding of what has negative impacts. So then at least we can appreciate what could be having a negative impact. And then where can we go? What kind of things can we do to be aware of that? And then we go into the fun ones. I always find these, they're very important to understand, but really hard to look at someone and go, chronic stress is bad for you. Be less stressed. For anyone that lives in the world of chronic stress, it's really hard when someone looks at you and go, you really got to be less stressed. It does not make you less stressed. And so it's important to understand what triggers stress, what reduces stress, because long-term stress hormones in your body through chronic stress really impact the gut microbiome, not only in terms of its composition and diversity, but it has known impacts on the permeability of the gut. And we talked about the impacts of, the gut becomes too permeable, leading to, increased inflammation. And then that goes on to lead to other things. So understanding that chronic stress plays a really big role, and that we need to be aware of the things that kind of help us de-stress, because that can help kind of reduce that loop in terms of, impacts on the gut-brain axis, impacts on gut permeability, by reducing the stress and being aware. And step number one is, admitting that you have chronic stress, and then working your way there. But finding those things, and we talk about, self-care, meditation, and good sleep. But all of those things are impacted when you're chronically stressed. So I think it's a little bit harder, but knowing that stress hormones and chronic stress impact the gut microbiome is an important one.
Yeah, and even cortisol, which is like the main stress hormone that people think and talk about. When you're stressed, your cortisol levels are elevated, and actually extended elevation of cortisol can down-regulate or decrease certain microbes or certain groups of bacteria within the gut, which then again, over a long enough time, will start to shift the healthy balance of the gut and create its own set of problems. And just like, we talked about the foods and preservatives and dyes and all those things that can be creating leaky gut and that gut permeability and inflammation, the same thing of elevated long-term stress. Like our bodies, and again, we mentioned the antibiotic thing, we are designed to handle short bursts of almost any complication, right? Whether it's like a lot of physical stress or a lot of mental stress, like, oh, there's a tiger, I got to run from it. But like, we can't always have tigers behind us. And that's generally what the modern stress today is, right? It's what our body perceives to be a tiger, but isn't actually a tiger. And the issue compared to the, what would have been the natural world hundreds or thousands of years ago would have been like, there's a tiger, either I lived or I died. And if I lived, the tiger eventually was gone and I was free to go about the world again until there was the next tiger. But now we constantly have this tiger and we're perceiving it the same way. And so our bodies are when we are under stress, are shunting all of the resources to the organs that need it, right? So your heart's getting more blood and your lungs are getting more, you're breathing faster and more efficiently. But is it important to be focusing on your digestion when there could be a tiger killing you? Absolutely not. So you're going to be shutting down digestion, right? And so patients could see this as like they're developing constipation, or their bowels are not emptying the way that they should, or they have undigested food in their stool. There's like a myriad of ways that you could see this showing up, but that's just the natural way. Like the body is saying, hey, we need to survive this tiger. But the trouble is that the tiger's never going away in this modern stress that people are in many cases experiencing. And so you're right, it's hard to come up with ways, and we're not necessarily the stress experts. There's other people that are really good at it, but that is something to be very aware of. And if you recognize in yourself that this could be going on, thinking about ways of dealing with this, and there's tons of tools, right? Whether it's the gym, which we know has a lot of positive impacts on the microbiome. It could be seeing counseling. It could be doing yoga or Pilates or biking or reading or there's a million ways that are shown to work. It's just finding what works for you and then thinking, okay, well, how do I need to design my life and my work in a way that are more conducive to minimizing the impact that stress is having on me.
And then tied, at least from my, a brain person perspective, tied to chronic stress or within that same realm is poor sleep. Unfortunately, the causes of poor sleep seem to be growing versus getting smaller, because we have impacts of kind of blue light, impacts of, longer days. So people are running their day longer and kind of cutting into to sleep. And as well, people aren't appreciating how we get into sleep. If you are awake and then you are asleep, you're not really going to sleep. You are crashing. There is a whole pattern of sleep. There's multiple different sleep cycles we have. We should spend each time for certain amounts. And if you have ever studied the brain, sleep is possibly one of the most complicated things that we do as humans somehow, because the body keeps going and does a lot of stuff. But it only does it when you're sleeping, or focuses in on that when you're sleeping. And the idea of having good sleep can be very complicated. There's this whole thing about the wind down and all these things. But really, when you break it down to how do we know, what's the best thing to think about in sleep? It really is about the whole concept of a circadian rhythm or a diurnal rhythm, depending on, what books you're reading. And so being awake when it is light outside and being asleep when it is dark outside is how our body was set up to do. And so there's a lot of hormones in that. There's a lot of cycling involved. And when we disrupt that cycle, there are a lot of negative impacts. It causes stress on the body. We loop back to chronic stress. And so we know shift work or altered cycle. So people kind of sleeping on the altered, sleeping in the day, being awake at night, have really negative impacts both on the gut microbiome, but are linked to many chronic conditions. And so I think the appreciation that our bodies were set up to sleep when it is dark, and there's a whole system that goes along with that, then that helps support good sleep quality. You're fighting against the current if you're trying to sleep during the day because your body is not set up to do that. So even if you are sleeping, you may not be getting as good quality sleep. And so for me, that's kind of the root of it. And the impacts both on overall health as well as gut health in terms of sleep are astounding. And again, do we really understand why? No, because we don't fully understand sleep. And I don't know if we ever will in the short term really get why sleep is so important. We just know that not doing it well has many bad things that come along with it.
Well, and that's what's interesting, right? And I think as we've talked, like the synthesis of everything we've discussed both today on this podcast as well as others is like the body really strives to be in balance. It wants to have a flow. It wants to have a rhythm. And sleep is an example of a rhythm. Now, it has systems in place to help when the rhythm is out of kilter, right? Like the tiger example, right? Like the body has a way of addressing that high level of stress and dealing with it. The issue is when it becomes prolonged. And the same thing goes with sleep. Like you can get away with a night of bad sleep. Like your body can adjust, you can bounce back and be fine. The issue again becomes like years of prolonged sleep disturbances, unfortunately being, a parent to a newborn child or having shift work, like working in a hospital or any of the other jobs. I'm very grateful to these people. But the reality is that they're dying sooner because of the impacts this is having, the inflammation this is causing. And although we don't know a ton about this area, the microbiome has its own rhythm. It has its own rhythm like a sleep rhythm. It works differently, of course, but there's this natural rhythm that the microbiome has. And so by altering continuously your sleep-wake cycles and when you're eating and how you're eating and what you're eating and all of these things has a real impact that will then have downstream consequences to it. So everything is tied together and the body is always trying to maintain some level of balance and what we call homeostasis. In the gut, it's a microbial balance versus a dysbiosis. And so that's another real impact that directly we're having on the gut is this inflammation, is a disruption of this rhythm that is the microbiome. And then again, it leads to all these downstream things. Inflammation in the gut leads to leaky gut, leads to again, inflammation damages the gut microbiome. Now you stop producing the neurotransmitters and hormones and all the things that you need to get good sleep, be happy, and function appropriately. And so all of these things, when individually imbalanced, impact the whole.
And then when we talk, there's a couple, these ones will be a little bit faster. And then we've got two that I think are kind of key to get into. But we've got in tying with diet, and we kind of touched on this, but just generally as a society, we lack eating fiber. It is pretty much the most important food you can feed your gut. And a lot of modern diets are fiber deficient. So if you were looking for what things can I eat more of and to make a big difference in terms of diet, fiber, being aware of how much fiber you're eating is really key. And on the other side of that as well is being aware of the type of environmental toxins that you're being exposed to, pesticides being a big one, but as well as, heavy metals, microplastics, different types of pollutants and things like this are negatively impacting the gut microbiome as well.
Yes.
And then
one that's interesting and is kind of in play with all of these is really around the use of like overuse really of disinfectants and antibacterial products. Like we know that those have a real impact. And, thank God for showers and bathtubs and all these like wonderful modern inventions, toilets, all this stuff. But like compared to even 100 years ago, we are so overly clean comparatively, right? Like people were lucky if they got a bath once a week. Like you were rich if you could even bathe. And then if you did it and you had warm water, like, wow, what a luxury. And then, if you were in a big family and you happen to be the youngest, you'd be the last one to get a bath. And so you're even like, your microbiome is being exposed to all these other microbiomes. And so I although I do love a good shower, I do think there's such a thing as like over cleaning and being excessively hygienic, always using antibacterials and, the things on your hands and body. And so being aware of, we talked a lot about what you're consuming, right, from a food standpoint, and we didn't even talk about the antibiotics that can be in foods, especially meats. It's a big area, but yeah, your whole skin microbiome is very critical to your overall health and well-being as well. And so if you're using things that are damaging to the gut microbiome, like the foods, you can have these preservatives and dyes and chemicals and things. Well, so can skincare products. That's a huge thing. We talked about some of these toxins and things that are in the environment, while perfumes and other chemical things can have a real toxic impact as well. And so I think that's definitely something to be aware of. And, we were sort of joking offline before this podcast, but like getting out in nature, right? Like I always talk about like hugging a tree, like walking around barefoot. My kids are like wild animals. I mean, they're like always getting very dirty. And I advocate for it as much of a pain it is to clean up after them once they get into the house. But our natural environment is the original source of our microbiomes. And so the more that we can get into nature and get ourselves exposed to what is otherwise like a healthy, balanced microbiome, assuming, that's accessible to you versus like a chemically sprayed lawn, which is not great for you again. And just a quick anecdote, like we know people who live around golf courses within in a short proximity of them are at increased risk of developing some of these chronic diseases like neurological diseases and cancers. So what's on these lawns? Well, tons of pesticides and chemicals to keep them looking really nice and really green. My lawn at home looks trash. It's got weeds everywhere because I don't put any sprays on it, but it's also not a golf course. So
yeah, and I think my mom is a preschool teacher, and she always talks about, she says, too many kids have become indoor cats. We need more outdoor cats, because we live in we've learned to live in a society where we have more of an indoor lifestyle, and that is very sanitized. And we were getting to a point as a society where we were getting rid of the idea of hand sanitizers. They are back stronger than ever. But we also need to think about cleaning products. If you're using chemical antibacterial sprays, or that's every cleaning product you use is a not a non-chemical version of an sterilant, that's your whole space. You're now killing anything you had a chance of going out to. And to use my mom again, she always says, you should go sit in the grass, lie in the grass, roll around for a bit. And she's a big advocate of, mud kitchens and picking flowers and smelling things and, getting dirty. But it makes a big difference. And I think, we're seeing this kind of come back into common conversation, the idea of let's get outside, let's play outside, because there was a period of time where playing outside and getting outside was not the goal. And I think we tend to, as a society, kind of go to extremes for things. I don't know why. It's just how we are. But we're getting back into understanding the importance of, being around animals, being around nature, and getting connected with microbes. And I think even the same thing with the types of food we eat. Sometimes the food we're eating is so cleaned that I think we lose some of the benefits from the food itself, like eating the idea of, only eating the most shiny, beautiful apples. I'm like, where are all the other apples? Like, what apples did we get rid of to this guy? And so I think
why is the apple shiny to begin with? When you pick it from a tree, it doesn't look that way because it doesn't have a wax on it and all the other stuff. Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, and I think we don't appreciate that, like, all food isn't pretty. Like, I think it's like one of these things that we saw what apples look like on TV, and those were not really what food looked like. But we have to think the food that exists in nature is what all the other animals are eating. Why have we decided that our food has to be shiny or has to be cleaner or has to be like the perfect shape? And what do we lose getting to that? And what other foods? And so, if you live somewhere with a farmer's market, I think we do it with, the difference between a food at the supermarket versus the food at the farmer's market. There's a visual difference between those foods. And I'm not a food scientist. I just always want to know, like, how did we decide that? And then how do we get there? Like, what else is there? And so I think that's something to take into appreciation. Again, diet, funny. We keep coming back there. But the other thing is appreciating that there's a whole world happening outside and getting out there, touch grass, hug trees, and kind of embrace it. And then the last one, and this is kind of the one we're hinting at, one that you may not realize, but has a really big role. So kind of our surprise at the end. And this is stuff that happens at birth. So the difference between the microbiomes now not only the gut microbiome, but all of the microbiomes are impacted by birth route. So someone who is vaginally born, their gut microbiome, as well as their skin microbiome and other microbiomes, will look significantly different than those who are born by a C-section. The same is true as well with breastfeeding and formula feeding. There are significant differences between those populations. And so these are important to understand because this is like we talked about earlier, the beginning of the roadmap. And so we know that these are having an impact, and there is research trying to understand how can we offset this, because there is a case where someone needs to have a C-section, or that formula feeding is the best option. But we're looking into, on the science side, is how do we offset that so the populations don't look so different in terms of their microbiomes.
Yes. So if you don't know if you've been born vaginally or formula fed, if you have a lovely opportunity to still ask your mom. Your dad may or may not remember. But depending on the generation, right? I mean, there's generations where men were like smoking in the waiting room, waiting for the news of like, oh, it was a girl, and we're naming her, Bertha or whatever the name is, So things have changed a lot in that respect, and I've joked before that I kind of wish we had the old days, because it's a little traumatic from the male's perspective, at least in my my own individual experience as a parent of 3 kids. 2 of which were actually just born at home. But yeah, there's a huge impact there. And we do know, when looking at retrospectively large amounts of data, we're talking like thousands of patients who were born via C-section, the impact that it can have on things like developing type 1 diabetes or even obesity being tied to that. And there's sort of been this sort of granola, if you will, but old wise tale of doing vaginal swab of a newborn infant to try to replicate that in a case where the child needed to be born via C-section. However, that doesn't appear to actually be as beneficial. So there may be something about actually ingesting that as a part of coming out of the birth canal. And so there's really a cool, and I think we can end on this note, but there was a study done in Scandinavia where children born via C-section were in 2 groups. One where they actually did an oral FMT from the mother's stool with the first feeding. So they screened the mother, as they do anyways prior to delivery, but they screened the mother and made sure she didn't have anything pathogenic and infectious, sort of a version of what our donor screening at Novel Bio might look like. They then took that stool, processed it down, and then with the first feeding, and only one time, they gave the mother's stool microbiome to the newborn. And at 6 months, their microbiome was indistinguishable from a child who was born via a vaginal delivery. So this is like, wow, unreal. And I'm a huge advocate, of course, for FMT, but it's really a reactive way of treating a patient, right? Like, you're waiting until they're really ill in many cases, especially in the context of C. diff, before you're even giving FMT. But what would a proactive approach to microbiome health look like? And this is why we're advocating all of these things. Like, don't wait until it's presented in overt disease. Like, if you're seeing the fatigue, if you're seeing, digestive upset, whether it's diarrhea or constipation or bloating or excessive gas or other issues, you're going to want to try to be proactive so that you don't develop all these diseases. I mean, something's going to kill you eventually, but it would be nice to go out, without having the last 20 years of your life be set up for chronic disease. And so a world that I would love to see is being more proactive when a patient was born via C-section, or when they did take an antibiotic, especially if it was repeat uses of antibiotic or long-term use of antibiotics. What could we do to be more proactive? Of course, the diet is a huge factor, but I think in some of these cases, the only and sometimes the best route is going to be FMT. And so we've talked a lot on other episodes about FMT, but and so go back and look at those if you can or are able to. But this was a fun one.
Yeah. And then for anyone that doesn't know, FMT is Fecal Microbiota Transplantation. And if you are here, you may know that we are part of a company called Novel Biome. And one of our goals is both to increase the education around gut health and FMT, but as well we are a contract manufacturer of FMT, and one of our goals is try to expand the access as well as the research around FMT, because our understanding is the gut is growing and we're understanding how important it is. We just spent, almost 45 minutes talking about all the things that can destroy your gut because it can be linked to chronic disease. And part of this is, how do we restore that? And to Jason's point, how do we get to a point where we're being proactive before people are ill? What are the things we can be doing? And I think, we truly believe in looking at the research that, manipulating the gut microbiome through microbiome-based therapies are going to play a role. And we are building to that now. And so I hope you listen to this. I hope, part of me hopes none of these apply to you. But the other part is that something that we've talked about today turned on a light bulb, and you can see that, there's something going on that could be negatively impacting your gut, and that may be leading to some symptoms you're seeing, or maybe you're hearing this on the exact right moment where you aren't facing symptoms, but you're impacting. Some of these things are impacting your life, and you can start making cognitive choices to think about your gut health, which is tied to your overall health. And so, this was just talking about the things that can negatively impact, can be destroying your gut microbiome today. And we try to give you some, insights to, part of this is just understanding it so you can start to make changes. The other is, what kind of changes can I make? And let's be gut focused, because that's a big part of being, overall well. And as per always, we will be back with another episode about something that interests us. And if you're listening to this and you go, I have something really interesting they could talk about, we would love that. Put it in the comment. You can check out our website and send us a message through our contact us. And all you have to say is, I listened to your podcast and I think you should talk about this next. Because we want to talk about the things that you find interesting, though we've got lots of things we find interesting. So we will always be coming back with another episode. And thank you for joining us. Do you have anything to sign off with, Jason?
No, I would just say, if you can, share this with a friend. If you're a doctor, share it with your patients. And then like and subscribe and leave a comment. It really makes a difference in the YouTube algorithms and everywhere else this is posted. So your engagement and your continued watching time has an impact and helps us to get this mission of creating more education around the importance of the microbiome out there. So thank you for your help in helping spread the word.
And then we'll see you next time.